lobbying means an attempt by an interest group to influence a legislator's vote through direct personal contact with that legislator. Direct personal contact. So what does that mean? I directly contact their office and I ask to meet with them, and maybe I bring them out to a golf club somewhere while I tell them all about why they should vote for the proposals I want. I give them information and brochures. And one of the things we know is that according to the most recent filing with Congress, interest groups list more than $3.2 billion in annual spending on lobbying. So these groups are spending tons of money to influence. So the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which represents business groups, spent almost $1 billion. The American Medical Association, $270 million. General Electric, $300 million. Pharmaceutical manufacturers, $250 million. And what do they do with this money? Well, this reminds me of my own experience. When I was getting my Ph.D. in American politics, I had to decide what position I was going to take after my graduation. And I got a call from the food industry asking me to apply for a job with the food industry to be their lobbyist. So I flew down to Washington, D.C., and I got my best suit and tried to look really good. And we had an interview for an entire day. So they brought me out to a great lunch at this swanky restaurant. They asked me all these questions about what courses I took, and I told them I took courses in Congress and the presidency and public policy and elections and interest group behavior. So they liked all that, and they asked me specific questions about how is Congress organized, how does a presidency work, all of those kinds of things to see if I had the depth of knowledge that they were looking for. And then finally, they said, all right, Desario, if we gave you $2 million to defeat legislation which would regulate the food industry by making us put more information about the contents of our product and what's in it and its possible health impacts, and clearly we don't want that because it would cost us a lot of money to do that and it might make people not buy our products. How would you spend this money to defeat this legislation? So Quentin, I'm going to ask you to do something for me here. Do you have a calculator? I do. And Quentin is a former student of mine who's been helping with these presentations. He's done a great job. So they said, how would you do this? They said, you know, there's 535 Congress people. So clearly we don't need all of them, right? So let's do some math. So they need 268 votes to get a majority. So they said, Desario, what we're going to do is we're going to take this $2 million and divide it up among 268 people. So Quentin, the question is, if we divide $2 million among 268 people, how much money can you give each member?
$7,462.69.
$7,462 and some change. Okay. So if I go to you as a member of Congress, look, I want you to vote for our bill. Do not put these food standards on packaging. It's too onerous for us. And I'll tell you what, here's your campaign contribution for $7,462. How many of you say, well, you know what? I can really use that money for my campaign. Take it and vote the way they want. And I said to the members of this food industry group, I said, you know, there's a much better way to do this. And they said, well, what is it, Desario? And I said, well, you're assuming that we have to wait until the whole House and the whole Senate votes on this. But that's not how Congress works. Congress is broken down into committees. And if a committee doesn't vote to pass the legislation, it never gets to the whole House. I said, so what are you saying? So I said, so I would go to the Commerce Committee in the House and the Senate. And the Commerce Committee in the House has 25 members. And in the Senate, it has 15 members. Okay? So, Quentin, that's 40 members.
50.
Now divide $2 million by 40.
50 grand.
Now I can say to you, I'm going to give you 50 grand. Would that motivate you even more than the 7,000? And that's if I want all 40 votes. I don't need all 40 votes. All I need is 21 votes. So I can give you 100 grand. You see how it works? So, I made that presentation. And they said, Desario, we love the way you think. So, they said, let's get down to brass tacks. Here's what we'll give you if you come work for us. And they were going to give me a very large salary in 3 figures range. They told me I could pick membership to any 3 country clubs, 2 of them in the United States, 2 of them had to be domestic, and 1 overseas, and they would pay for it. They told me that I could get 1 luxury car every year. And I think the choices, as I recall, were a Mercedes, a BMW, or I forget what the third one was. And they would also give me a charge card in which I could spend $10,000 a month on in my discretion to entertain any members of Congress, to entertain any members of the President's staff. And I looked at them and I said, thank you, but no thank you. I want to teach young people. Boy, am I an idiot, right? So instead of being a very wealthy lobbyist, I became a professor, making hardly any money because I care so much about teaching you guys. So guess what, guys? You better take this serious. All right? Because most people do not make the stupid decision I made. Most people are enticed by that kind of money, that kind of lifestyle. Some of my former students are big-time lobbyists right now, making hundreds of thousands of dollars, living in penthouses in New York City, representing the financial industry. And I taught them how to do this. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the influence of money. And we see this all the time in Congress. First of all, who becomes the lobbyist? People like me. And what we find now is that over 40% of representatives and senators who leave Congress because they're unelected or retire become lobbyists. So do they know how the institution works? You bet. Do they have friends who probably owe them favors? You bet. And do they make a lot of money? You bet. So we find on average these people make over $2 million a year. And you got to believe a company is not going to be paying these people $2 million a year unless they're producing something they want. Companies aren't stupid. The bottom line is the bottom line. So the point is, these two things help explain why interest group lobbying is so biased towards the smallest, well-financed business groups. And we see this in lots of different areas. So for example, you guys probably don't know this, but the United States Congress for the last 20-something years, actually it's a little more than that now, has passed every year billions of dollars in tobacco subsidies that go to the tobacco industry to underwrite tobacco production. Now think about that. Should we be spending billions of dollars on tobacco production, especially when we know tobacco is bad for you and is a health problem? Well, why do we do this? Well, first of all, what we know is that Philip Morris and other major tobacco producers donate millions of dollars every year to both parties. To both parties. And then what we find is on the Agriculture Committee, which has to vote on these tobacco subsidies, the chairman and the members of that committee receive huge donations just before the vote. What a coincidence. So when Senator Richard Durbin from Illinois had proposed the legislation to eliminate federal tobacco subsidies, it lost in the House and it lost in the Senate by narrow votes, 53 to 47 in the Senate, 216 to 209 in the House. But that's all you want to do if you're a lobbyist. You just want to win by narrow margins because it allows you to be more effective. We see the same thing with gun control issues. So all of the surveys in recent polls show that about 75% of the public favors tougher gun control laws in regard to assault weapons, in regard to semi-automatic weapons. And we just saw this play out in the Trump administration about a year and a half ago, if you remember, when a bunch of students again were shot on campus and killed. And as you know, at this point, there are numerous school and public shootings over the last few years. No country has more people dying from gun violence domestically, without a war in other words, than the United States. So what we see is Congress, after the school shooting, introduced legislation, the Democratic Party introduced it, to provide more regulations on the purchase and possession of weapons. Trump first said he would support the legislation, if you remember. Then he had a couple of meetings with the NRA, which is the National Rifle Association, and he changed his opinion and he vetoed the legislation. Why? Well, the NRA has about 20 million members and an annual budget of $100 million a year, of which it gave a great deal of it to President Trump. So it has a lot of money and a lot of influence. So it can directly go to members of Congress and say, if you want us to continue to support you, you must vote for our perspective on gun control, which is we oppose it. We oppose it. As a matter of fact, the NRA issued official statement saying all semi-automatic weapons are legitimate hunting weapons. And believe me, when we're talking about semi-automatic, you can fire a lot of bullets in a minute with a semi-automatic, because all you're really doing is keep pulling the trigger and it keeps shooting. So I'm not too sure what kind of hunting you do with this. I don't think you do rabbit hunting, okay? I mean, you start shooting with a semi-automatic, the tail's going to be over here, the head will be over there. I don't think that's what hunting is about. So it seems pretty clear to most people who know anything about weaponry that, you know, semi-automatic weapon is not really a hunting weapon. And there's just something happened yesterday that's of tremendous interest in regard to guns. Many of the states have closed down gun shops. So what did the NRA do? They sued in court, saying that this is illegal because guns are an essential service. And in one locality, they actually won the lawsuit. So the state has to now reopen gun shops, because guess what, people? Gun shops are essential during the time of coronavirus. And within that context, we know that people have been buying lots of guns recently. And a lot of ammunition. I know Quentin's brother has bought tons of ammunition. How many rounds did he buy?
1,000.
1,000 rounds. So I guess when the government comes to take away his food or whatever he thinks they're going to do, he can shoot up a lot of federal agents. All right. So that's direct lobbying. Those are all examples of how directly to use money. We said the other way is through what we refer to as grassroots lobbying. And that's on page 274 of your book. And grassroots lobbying is a lobbying activity by an interest group where they try and activate their rank and file, their membership. And to make this rank and file, these group members, activate and try and make demands upon their members of Congress and on the President of the United States to write letters, to protest, to send emails, to demonstrate. And one of the ways they do that is by giving information to their members on how to do it. So, for example, the NRA funds this magazine, and it is called Freedom. People, really what it is, and mostly what it is, you know, it's a pro-gun magazine. So, you know, here, you can buy the Panther semi-automatic weapon. Some more nice weapons you can buy. A picture of a dad with his son showing him how to shoot his gun. The family that shoots together stays together. And there's numerous other kinds of ads. And then they have a page on elections. So they also tell their members who to vote for or who not to vote for. So in regard to one very important election, and I won't say which one it is at this point, they said the following thing about the two candidates. When gun control legislation has been introduced in Ohio, this candidate was usually listed as its sponsor, that commie. Just last year, the candidate wanted to ban the sale and transfer of semi-automatic firearms and wanted also to impose a statewide 14-day waiting period background investigation for all gun purchases and transfers. Fortunately, his opponent, and I won't mention his name, was able to prevent the passage of these and other anti-gun bills. Rarely have voters been presented with a clearer difference between candidates on gun control issues. We strongly urge you to actively support, and then they name the candidate that they obviously support, and here's how we grade them. So the candidate that they supported, they gave an A to. The candidate who they didn't support, they gave an F minus, which is even worse than me. I don't give you guys minuses. I might give you an F, but I'm not going to give you an F minus. That's a little too much. So they send these out to their members to try and influence the opinions, the behavior of their membership. And then they'll send them out different notices telling them to activate, to write letters, to demonstrate. So if you have one group that's very active and is spending money and giving money, and the general public, 75%, remember the 75% of the general public thinks we should have more regulations on the purchase and transfer of semi-automatic weapons. Most people are very concerned about all the killings that have been going on. But do they get activated? Do they make demands on the member of Congress? Or is another let George do it, free rider problem? Oh, someone will do it, but no one does. Okay. The last thing we're going to talk about in this context then are campaign finance laws. And when you talk about campaign finance laws, 1972 is kind of the most important watershed year in understanding campaign finance in the United States. So prior to that time, there were no federal laws regulating campaign contributions. So in other words, all candidates operated under what was referred to as a wide open system of campaign financing, a system that provided and permitted unlimited contributions and unlimited spending by candidates. So just to kind of give you an example, we'll look historically at some presidential elections. (1960), 64, 68, and 72. So in 1960, we had John Kennedy against Richard Nixon, and it was a very close race. And together they spent $20 million on their presidential campaigns. In 64, LBJ versus Goldwater, not a very close race. LBJ was way ahead, so they spent about $25 million. 1968, a very close race between Nixon and Hubert Humphrey, and they spent $44 million. 72, one of the biggest blowouts in the history of presidential elections. President Nixon was running for re-election, and he ran against who? I mean, if you guys even know who this is, that'd be pretty good. He ran against a guy named George McGovern, who was from South Dakota, so he didn't even have much of a base. And the campaign, McGovern was extremely liberal. I mean, he was kind of like the Bernie Sanders of the day, even more liberal for those times. He wanted to legalize marijuana and do all these other things that were considered very socially liberal. And he picked the governor of Missouri as his vice presidential running mate. And like 2 weeks after they picked him, they found out that he had been institutionalized about 10 years prior for a nervous breakdown and mental problems. So that blew up in his face. So then he picked a guy named Sergeant Shriver, who had never run for public office before, which at that time was important. You would not elect someone who didn't have public experience to be your president or your vice president. So his campaign was a disaster. So the question you would think is, okay, so how much is being spent in 1972 and what's going to be a landslide election? So it went from 20 to 25, which was not a close race. This was a close race. 44 went up because it was very close. What happens in 72 where it's a blowout? And what we find is they spent $104 million. A huge increase. Why? Because industries knew Nixon was going to win. So that was the sure bet. So they all wanted to be on his side and give him money and get political favors. We'll stop here for a second.